Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Margaret had always believed that silence was peaceful. At 67 years old, she had earned her quiet life in the small town of Ashford, North Carolina. Her husband, Walter, had passed 5 years ago, and since then she filled her days with simple pleasures, tending to her rose garden, drinking sweet tea on the porch, and chatting with her neighbor Lorraine about nothing in particular. But there was one silence that haunted her, the silence from her daughter, Diane. It had been 8 months since Margaret last heard her daughter's voice, 8 months since she had seen her granddaughter, Emily. Every phone call went unanswered, every letter returned unopened. Diane always had excuses. She was busy, Emily had school, the timing was never right. Margaret told herself not to worry. Diane was an adult. She had her own life. Some distance was normal. But on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang with a call that would change everything. Mrs. Margaret Davis. The voice on the other end was professional but tense. Yes, this is she. Ma'am, this is Nurse Patricia from St. Anthony's Hospital in Ridgemont. We have your granddaughter, Emily, here. She was brought in this morning. We need you to come immediately. Margaret's heart stopped. Emily? What happened? Is she all right? Where's her mother? There was a pause that lasted far too long. Mrs. Davis, please come as soon as you can. We will explain everything when you arrive. The 40-minute drive felt like hours. Margaret gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities. An accident? An illness? And where was Diane? Why wasn't she the one calling? When Margaret arrived at the hospital, nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Emily lay in a small bed, pale as the white sheets beneath her. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow. She looked so fragile, so thin, like a flower that had been denied sunlight for far too long. Emily, Margaret whispered, approaching slowly. Sweetheart, it's Grandma. The little girl opened her eyes. For a moment there was no recognition. Then, slowly, a faint whisper. Grandma? Margaret took her hand, fighting back tears. What had happened to this child? Where had the bright, energetic girl from her memories gone? A nurse appeared at the door. Mrs. Davis, the doctor would like to speak with you, in private. Margaret kissed Emily's forehead and followed the nurse into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The walls felt like they were closing in. The nurse stopped and turned to face her. Her expression was troubled, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Davis, I need to prepare you. What we found during Emily's examination, it's not what we expected. The doctor is running more tests, but she hesitated as if searching for words that would not come. Something has happened to this child, something that should never happen to any little girl. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. What do you mean? What did you find? The nurse looked at her with eyes full of sorrow. Please come with me. The doctor will explain everything. But Mrs. Davis, you need to be strong now. That little girl in there is going to need you more than ever. What had happened to Emily during those 8 months of silence? What dark secret was hiding behind closed doors? And where was Diane when her daughter needed her most? The answers were coming. But Margaret was not ready for the truth. Margaret followed the nurse down a long corridor that seemed to stretch into eternity. Each step echoed against the cold tile floor. The smell of antiseptic filled her nostrils, but all she could think about was Emily's hollow eyes staring back at her. They stopped in front of a door marked Private Consultation Room. The nurse knocked twice before opening it. Inside, a man in a white coat sat behind a desk covered with papers and medical files. He stood when Margaret entered, extending his hand. Mrs. Davis, I'm Dr. Samuel Henderson. Please sit down. Margaret lowered herself into the chair across from him. Her legs felt weak, her hands trembling in her lap. Doctor, please tell me what's happening. What's wrong with my granddaughter? Dr. Henderson removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying a weight too heavy to bear. Mrs. Davis, Emily was brought in early this morning by a neighbor who found her collapsed in the hallway of her apartment building. She was experiencing severe abdominal pain. We assumed it was something routine, an infection, perhaps appendicitis. He paused. The silence in the room was deafening. We ran tests. We performed an ultrasound. He shook his head slowly, as if still processing his own words. What we found, it doesn't make clinical sense. Not for a child her age. Margaret leaned forward. What do you mean? What did you find? The doctor met her eyes, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. Mrs. Davis, I've been practicing medicine for over 30 years. I've seen things that would break most people. But this, he took a deep breath. We've called a pediatric specialist from Raleigh. We're running more tests, but the image is there. We don't want to believe it, ma'am. Not in a 9-year-old girl. Margaret's mind refused to process his words. I don't understand. What are you saying? I'm saying that something happened to Emily. Something that no child should ever experience. Her condition, the physical evidence, it tells a story. A story that someone needs to explain. The room began to spin. Margaret gripped the armrests of her chair to steady herself. Where is my daughter? She demanded. Where is Diane? She should be here. She's Emily's. Mother? Dr. Henderson exchanged a glance with the nurse. That's part of the problem, Mrs. Davis. We've been unable to locate Diane. The phone number on Emily's emergency contact list has been disconnected. The neighbor who brought Emily in said she hasn't seen Diane in over a week. Over a week. Her daughter had been missing for over a week, and no one had noticed. No one had called. No one had checked on a 9-year-old girl living alone. A knock on the door interrupted them. A woman in a gray blazer entered, carrying a leather folder. Mrs. Davis, I'm Vivian Torres from Child Acese. Protective Services. I'm sorry to meet you under these circumstances. Margaret looked at her, then back at the doctor. Child Protective Services? Why are they involved? Vivian sat down beside her, her expression professional but not unkind. Ma'am, when a child is brought to the hospital in Emily's condition, we're required by law to investigate. We need to understand what happened. We need to find out who is responsible. Responsible? Margaret's voice cracked. You think her family did this? We're not accusing anyone, Mrs. Davis, but we have to ask questions. We have to examine every possibility. Vivian opened her folder, pen ready. When was the last time you saw your granddaughter? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. 8 months. 8 months since she had held Emily in her arms. 8 months since she had heard her laugh. 8 months of silence that she had accepted without question. 8 months, she whispered. It's been 8 months. Vivian wrote something down. The scratch of pen on paper sounded like an accusation. And during that time, did you have any contact with your daughter or granddaughter? Phone calls, letters? I tried. I called every week, but Diane never answered. She said she needed space. I thought I was respecting her wishes. Vivian nodded slowly but said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. Dr. Henderson stood. Mrs. Davis, Emily is stable for now. She's frightened and confused, but physically she's out of immediate danger. However, we'll need to keep her here for observation while the investigation proceeds. Investigation, Margaret repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. She thought of Emily lying in that hospital bed, alone, scared, wondering where her mother was, wondering why no one had protected her. And then she thought of Diane, her own daughter. Where was she? What had happened in that apartment? What secrets had been hiding behind those unanswered phone calls? Vivian closed her folder and looked at Margaret directly. Mrs. Davis, I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you one more thing. She paused. Do you know anyone named Harold? Margaret frowned. Harold? No, I don't know anyone by that name. Why? Because when Emily woke up briefly this morning before you arrived, she asked for someone. Vivian's voice dropped lower. She asked if Mr. Harold knew she was here. Who was Harold? What role did he play in Emily's life? And what had been happening inside that apartment while the world looked away? The investigation was only beginning, and the truth was darker than anyone imagined. The name echoed in Margaret's mind, long after she left the consultation room. Harold. She had never heard Emily mention that name before. She had never heard Diane speak of anyone called Harold. But then again, how much did she really know about her daughter's life anymore? Margaret returned to Emily's room and sat in the chair. Beside her bed, the little girl was asleep now, her breathing shallow but steady. In the dim light of the hospital room, Margaret studied her granddaughter's face. The sharp cheekbones that shouldn't be visible on a child so young. The dark circles beneath her eyes, the way her small body seemed to disappear beneath the blankets. This was not the Emily she remembered. 2 years ago, Emily had been a bundle of energy. She would run through Margaret's garden chasing butterflies, her laughter filling the summer air. She would sit on the kitchen counter while Margaret baked cookies, sneaking bits of dough when she thought no one was looking. What had happened to that little girl? Margaret closed her eyes and let her mind drift back through the years, searching for answers she should have sought long ago. Diane had always been different. Even as a child, she was sensitive. Too sensitive, some would say. She felt everything deeply. A harsh word could send her into tears for hours. A cloudy day could darken her mood for a week. Margaret had always attributed it to artistic temperament. Diane loved to paint, to write poetry, to lose herself in worlds of imagination. But after Diane married Derek, things began to change. At first, the marriage seemed happy enough. Derek was charming, ambitious, always chasing the next big opportunity. But his ambitions never quite materialized. Jobs came and went. Money was always tight. And slowly, the light in Diane's eyes began to fade. When Emily was born, Margaret hoped things would improve. And for a while, they did. Diane poured all her love into that baby girl. She was devoted, attentive, determined to give Emily the stable childhood she felt she never had. But then came the divorce. Derek left when Emily was 4 years old. He moved to California, promising to stay in touch, to send money, to visit on holidays. None of those promises were kept. Within a year, he had disappeared entirely, a ghost who left nothing behind but broken dreams and unpaid bills. Diane spiraled after that. She stopped painting, stopped writing, stopped answering phone calls. She moved from town to town, always looking for a fresh start, never finding one. Margaret offered help countless times. Money, a place to stay, someone to talk to. But Diane always refused. "I'm fine, Mom. I just need space. I need to figure things out on my own." And Margaret, not wanting to push, not wanting to drive her daughter further away, had accepted those words at face value. Now, sitting in this hospital room, she realized the terrible cost of that acceptance. She should have pushed harder. She should have shown up unannounced. She should have demanded to see Emily to make sure she was safe. Instead, she had respected boundaries that should never have existed. A soft sound broke through her thoughts. Emily was stirring. "Grandma?" The voice was so small, so fragile. "I'm here, sweetheart." Margaret took her hand gently. "I'm right here." Emily's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the room, confused, disoriented. "Where's Mommy?" The question pierced Margaret's heart. How could she explain that she didn't know, that no one knew? "Mommy had to go somewhere for a little while," Margaret said softly. "But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Emily seemed to accept this, though her eyes remained troubled. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ceiling. Then she spoke again. "Grandma, is Mr. Harold going to visit me?" Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Who is Mr. Harold, sweetheart?" Emily turned her head slowly to look at her grandmother. There was something in her eyes, something that looked far too old for a 9-year-old girl. "He lives downstairs. He's nice. He gives me food when Mommy forgets to cook. He helps me with my homework." She paused. He said I'm special. Margaret forced herself to keep her voice calm even as alarm bells screamed inside her head. How long have you known Mr. Harold? Emily thought about it. A long time, since we moved to the apartment. Mommy said he was our friend. Our friend. A stranger living in the same building, spending time with a vulnerable child while her mother was where? Locked in her room, lost in her own darkness? Margaret wanted to ask more questions, but Emily's eyes were already closing again. The medication was pulling her back into sleep. Rest now, sweetheart, Margaret whispered, though her own heart was racing. Just rest. She sat there in the darkness, holding her granddaughter's hand as the pieces of a terrible puzzle began to take shape in her mind. A daughter drowning in mental illness, a child left to fend for herself, and a neighbor who had positioned himself as a savior. What had really been happening in that apartment? The investigation was about to uncover secrets that had been buried in silence for far too long, and Margaret would soon learn that the danger had been closer than anyone ever suspected. The next morning, Margaret woke with a stiff neck and aching back. She had refused to leave Emily's side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair with her hand still resting near her granddaughter's. A knock on the door startled her. A tall man in a dark suit entered, his expression serious but not unkind. Mrs. Davis, I'm Detective Robert Callahan, Ridgemont Police Department. He showed his edge. I'm leading the investigation into your granddaughter's case. Do you have a moment to talk? Margaret nodded and followed him into the hallway, glancing back at Emily, who was still asleep. Mrs. Davis, I want to be honest with you, Detective Callahan began. We've been to the apartment where your daughter and granddaughter were living. What we found there, he shook his head. It paints a very troubling picture. What do you mean? The apartment was in terrible condition. The refrigerator was nearly empty. Just some expired milk and a few crackers. The electricity had been shut off for non-payment. Emily's clothes were old, worn out, far too small for her. He paused. It appears that child has been living in severe neglect for quite some time. Margaret felt her stomach turn. And my daughter? Diane? Have you found her? Not yet, we're still searching, but based on what the neighbors told us, she hasn't been seen in over a week. Some say even longer. He pulled out a small notebook. Mrs. Davis, I need to ask you about someone. A man named Harold Brennan. The name hit Margaret like a wave of cold water. Emily mentioned him, she said quietly. She asked if he knew she was here, but I've never heard of him before yesterday. Detective Callahan nodded slowly. Harold Brennan is 58 years old. He lives in the apartment directly below your daughter's unit. According to the other residents, he chose his words carefully, very involved in Emily's life. Involved how? He was seen with her regularly, walking her to school, bringing her groceries, sitting with her in the building's courtyard. The detective's jaw tightened. Several neighbors mentioned that Emily spent a lot of time in his apartment, sometimes for hours. Margaret's hands began to tremble, and no one thought that was strange. A grown man spending that much time with a little girl. That's the problem, Mrs. Davis. Everyone thought he was being helpful. They saw a kind neighbor stepping in where the mother couldn't. They saw someone filling a gap. He closed his notebook. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked closer. Margaret leaned against the wall for support. The pieces were falling into place now. Terrible, heartbreaking pieces that formed a picture she couldn't bear to see. There's more, Detective Callahan continued. When we searched the apartment, we found things hidden in Emily's room. Small gifts, stuffed animals, candy, hair ribbons, all still in their wrapping. And notes. Notes? Handwritten cards. Some said things like, "You're my special girl," and "Our little secret." They were all signed with the letter H. Margaret closed her eyes. The hallway seemed to spin around her. We also found a drawer full of letters, the detective added. Written by your daughter. Dozens of them, addressed to you. None of them were ever sent. Letters? To me? We haven't read them all yet. They're part of the evidence. Now, but from what we've seen, your daughter was struggling. Badly. She wrote about hearing voices, about being afraid, about not knowing how to ask for help. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Her daughter had been crying out in silence, filling pages with words that never reached anyone. And all the while, Emily had been slipping through the cracks. "What about Harold?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is he now?" "That's why I'm here." Detective Callahan's expression hardened. "Harold Brennan was seen leaving town 2 days ago, right around the time Emily was taken to the hospital. We've issued a warrant for his arrest, but so far we haven't been able to locate him." "He ran," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "It appears so. And innocent men don't usually run, Mrs. Davis." Margaret thought of Emily lying in that hospital bed, asking about Mr. Harold, wondering if he would visit, not understanding, not yet, what he truly was. "Detective," she said slowly, "what happens now? Now we find him. We build the case. We make sure that whoever did this to your granddaughter faces justice." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "And we make sure Emily is safe. That's where you come in." "Me? That little girl has been failed by every adult in her life. Her father abandoned her. Her mother couldn't protect her. The neighbors looked the other way. The system didn't catch her in time." His eyes met hers. "But you're here now. She's going to need someone to fight for her." Margaret straightened her spine. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something other than despair. She felt determination. "I'll fight," she said. "Whatever it takes. I'm not letting that child down again." Harold Brennan had vanished into the shadows, but the truth he left behind was beginning to surface, and Margaret would not rest until every secret was brought into the light. 2 days after Emily was hospitalized, the police finally found Diane. She was in a run-down motel 40 minutes outside of Ridgemont, registered under a false name. When officers knocked on her door, she didn't answer. They found her sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, muttering words that made no sense. Margaret received the call from Detective Callahan that afternoon. "We're transporting her to Greenview Psychiatric Hospital for evaluation," he explained. "She's not in any condition to answer questions right now. The doctors believe she's experiencing a severe mental health crisis." Margaret drove to Greenview that evening, her heart heavy with dread and desperate hope. Maybe Diane could explain. Maybe there was some reason, some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. But when she walked into that sterile white room and saw her daughter, all hope crumbled. Diane sat on the edge of the bed, thin as a skeleton, her hair matted and unwashed. Her eyes darted around the room, seeing things that weren't there. She flinched at shadows, whispered responses to voices only she could hear. "Diane?" Margaret approached slowly. "Sweetheart, it's Mom." Diane looked up, but there was no recognition in her eyes. She stared through Margaret as if she were made of glass. "They're watching," Diane whispered. "They're always watching. I tried to keep her safe, I tried." "Keep who safe, Emily?" At the sound of her daughter's name, something flickered in Diane's expression, a moment of clarity breaking through the fog. "Emily," she repeated. "My baby, is she okay? Is she safe?" "She's in the hospital, Diane. She's very sick." Margaret knelt beside her daughter. What happened? What happened to Emily?" But Diane was slipping away again, retreating into the darkness of her own mind. The psychiatrist, Dr. Warren, met Margaret in the hallway afterward. "Your daughter is suffering from severe psychosis, likely schizophrenia that's gone untreated for years," he explained. "Combined with malnutrition, isolation, and extreme stress, her condition has deteriorated significantly. She may have periods of lucidity, but right now she's not capable of caring for herself, let alone a child." "How long has she been like this?" "Based on what we can tell, the symptoms probably started years ago but worsened dramatically in recent months, without medication, without support, without anyone checking on her." He shook his head. It's a tragedy, Mrs. Davis, one that could have been prevented. Before Margaret left, a nurse handed her a cardboard box. These were found in your daughter's belongings, the nurse said. We thought you should have them. Margaret opened the box in her car. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to her, none ever sent. She picked one up with trembling hands and began to read. The handwriting was shaky, the sentences fragmented. Mom, I wanted to call today, but the voices said you wouldn't believe me. Emily asked about you. She misses you. I try to be strong, but everything is so dark. I forget to eat sometimes. I forget to do everything. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Margaret read letter after letter, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter had been drowning, reaching out in the only way she could, and no one had been there to catch her. At the bottom of the box, she found one final letter. The last line made her blood run cold. He says he's helping with Emily. He seems so kind, but sometimes the way he looks at her. Mom, I don't know what to do. I'm scared, but I don't know if the fear is real or if it's just the voices again. Margaret clutched the letter to her chest and sobbed. Her daughter had sensed the danger. She had tried to warn someone, but trapped in her own broken mind, unable to trust her own thoughts, she had been powerless to stop it. The pieces of this tragedy were becoming clearer, but the full truth, the truth about Harold Brennan and what happened behind closed doors, was still waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 6. The Neighborhood of Silence. Detective Callahan continued his investigation over the following days, interviewing every resident in the apartment building where Diane and Emily had lived. Margaret asked to see the reports. What she read made her sick. Everyone knew Harold Brennan. Such a nice man, one neighbor said. Always willing to help carry groceries. He fixed my leaky faucet once, another recalled. Didn't even ask for payment. That little girl was lucky to have him looking out for her, a third commented. Her mother was clearly not well. At least, someone was taking care of the child. Not a single person had questioned why a 58-year-old man was spending so much time alone with a 9-year-old girl. Not one had thought to call the authorities, to check on Emily, to ask if something was wrong. Margaret needed to understand. She drove to the apartment building herself. The place was old and tired, peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, a front door that didn't lock properly. She climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where Diane's apartment remained sealed with yellow police tape. Then she knocked on the door across the hall. A woman answered. She was in her early 70s with white hair and worried eyes. Her name was Ruth. You're the grandmother, Ruth said quietly. I recognize you from the news. May I come in? Ruth hesitated, then stepped aside. Her apartment was small but tidy, filled with photographs of grandchildren who lived far away. She offered Margaret tea with shaking hands. I know why you're here, Ruth said before Margaret could speak. You want to know why I didn't do anything. Margaret set down her cup. Did you see things, Ruth? Did you know something was wrong? The old woman's eyes filled with tears. I saw things, she admitted. I saw Emily wandering the hallways alone at night. I heard Diane screaming at people who weren't there. I saw Harold always nearby, always watching, always so helpful. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue. But I was raised to mind my own business. My generation. We don't pry. We don't make accusations. We assume families handle their own problems. A child was suffering, Margaret said, her voice harder than she intended. I know. Ruth's voice broke. I know that now. I lie awake every night seeing that little girl's face. I ask myself over and over, what if I had knocked on that door? What if I had called someone? What if I had just asked Emily if she was okay? She looked at Margaret with devastation in her eyes. I will carry this guilt until the day I die, Mrs. Davis. I saw the signs and I chose to look away. That's something I can never undo. Margaret wanted to be angry. She wanted to blame this woman and everyone else who had failed Emily. But looking at Ruth's trembling hands and tear-stained face, she saw something familiar. She saw herself. Hadn't she also looked away? Hadn't she also accepted silence as an answer? Hadn't she also trusted that everything was fine because it was easier than confronting the truth? Margaret stood to leave. At the door, Ruth grabbed her arm. "Please," the old woman whispered, "take care of that child. Do what I couldn't do. Don't let her disappear into silence again." Margaret nodded slowly. "I won't," she promised. "Not ever again." The neighborhood had watched and done nothing. The system had failed. But Margaret was determined to break the cycle of silence, no matter what it took. With each passing day, Emily grew a little stronger. The color began returning to her cheeks. She could sit up in bed, eat small meals, even watch cartoons on the hospital television. But the wounds that didn't show were far deeper. Margaret visited every single day without fail. She brought Emily's favorite stuffed animals, picture books, and homemade cookies. Slowly, carefully, she tried to rebuild the connection that 8 months of silence had broken. Emily didn't talk much at first. She answered questions with nods or single words. But Margaret didn't push. She simply sat beside her, read stories aloud, and let the little girl know she wasn't alone. Then one afternoon, Emily started to open up. "Mommy got sick," she said quietly, staring at her hands. Not sick like a cold, sick in her head. She would stay in her room for days. Sometimes she forgot to make dinner. Sometimes she forgot I was there. Margaret's heart shattered, but she kept her voice gentle. "That must have been very, hard for you, sweetheart." Emily nodded. "I learned to make sandwiches. I learned to walk to school by myself. I learned to be quiet so Mommy could rest." A 9-year-old child, taking care of herself because there was no one else. "What about Mr. Harold?" Margaret asked carefully. Emily's expression shifted. Not quite fear, but something guarded. "He was nice at first. He gave me food when we didn't have any. He helped me with my homework. He said I was special." She paused. "He said I was his favorite person in the whole world." Margaret felt ice spreading through her veins. "Did Mr. Harold ever do anything that made you uncomfortable?" Emily was silent for a long moment. Then she looked up at her grandmother with eyes that seemed far too old for her age. "Grandma," she whispered, "what did I do wrong to get so sick?" The question broke something inside Margaret. This precious child blamed herself. She didn't understand that none of this was her fault. Margaret pulled Emily into a gentle embrace. "You did nothing wrong," she said firmly. "Nothing at all. You are brave and strong, and none of this is your fault. Do you understand me?" Emily buried her face in her grandmother's shoulder and began to cry softly. The truth was still buried deep inside Emily's heart. But Margaret would wait. She would be patient. And when Emily was ready to speak, she would be there to listen. Chapter 8. The Weight of Guilt. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She sat alone in her small living room back in Ashford, surrounded by the letters Diane had never sent. She read them again, one by one, each word cutting deeper than the last. Her daughter had been drowning, crying out in the only way she could. And Margaret had been just 40 minutes away, tending her roses, drinking sweet tea, waiting for a phone call that never came. Why hadn't she driven to that apartment? Why hadn't she demanded to see Emily? Why had she accepted Diane's excuses so easily? "I needed space, Mom." "We're fine, Mom." "The timing isn't right, Mom." Lies. Or maybe not lies. Maybe desperate attempts to hide a truth too painful to speak. Either way, Margaret had believed them because believing was easier than questioning. She thought about Ruth, the neighbor who saw everything and said nothing. She had judged that woman harshly. But wasn't she guilty of the same sin? The silence hadn't just come from strangers. It had come from family, too. A knock at the door startled her. It was nearly midnight. Lorraine, her neighbor of 30 years, stood on the porch in her bathrobe. "I saw your light on," Lorraine said softly. "Figured you might need some company." Margaret let her in. They sat together in the dim living room while Margaret poured out everything. The hospital, the letters, the guilt that was eating her alive. Lorraine listened without interrupting. When Margaret finally fell silent, exhausted from crying, her old friend spoke. "You didn't cause this. Margaret, you didn't know. I should have known. I'm her mother. And Diane is Emily's mother. Does that mean she caused this?" Lorraine shook her head. "Blame is easy. It's what we do when we can't make sense of tragedy. But blame won't help Emily now." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Then what will?" Lorraine took her hand. "You can't change the past, but you can change what comes next. That little girl needs someone to fight for her, someone who won't look away, someone who won't accept silence as an answer ever again." Margaret sat with those words long after Lorraine left. By morning she had made her decision. She would file for temporary custody of Emily. She would bring her granddaughter home, and she would spend whatever years she had left making sure that child never felt invisible again. Filing for custody was not as simple as Margaret had hoped. The social worker, Vivian Torres, explained the process during a meeting at the county office. There would be home inspections, background checks, psychological evaluations. The court would need to determine if a 67-year-old woman was capable of raising a traumatized child. "It's not personal, Mrs. Davis," Vivian said. "It's procedure. The system has to protect Emily's best interests." "The system already failed her," Margaret replied, unable to hide her frustration. Vivian didn't argue. She simply nodded. While the paperwork moved slowly, Emily was transferred from the hospital to a temporary shelter for children. Margaret visited every day, but she couldn't take her granddaughter home. Not yet. The waiting was agony. One afternoon, Margaret found Vivian alone in the hallway outside the shelter. The social worker looked tired, the kind of tired that went beyond sleepless nights. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. Vivian nodded. "Why do you care so much about this case? I've seen how hard you're working. It's more than just a job to you." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 years ago, there was another case, another little girl. I saw the warning signs, but there was so much paperwork, so many procedures to follow. I hesitated. I waited for approvals that took too long." She paused. "By the time I got authorization to intervene, it was too late." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. That child didn't survive what was happening to her. Vivian continued. "I think about her every single day. I carry her with me everywhere I go." She looked directly at Margaret. "I won't let that happen to Emily. I won't hesitate again." Margaret saw the weight of that old wound in Vivian's eyes. She understood now. This wasn't just a case for Vivian. It was a chance at redemption. "Then we fight together," Margaret said. Vivian nodded slowly. "Together." She handed Margaret a folder. "There's something you should know. Harold Brennan is still denying everything. Without Emily's testimony, building a case against him will be difficult." Her jaw tightened. "But we're gathering evidence, the gifts, the notes, the neighbor statements. We're not giving up." Margaret took the folder, her resolve hardening. "Neither am I." The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Margaret felt she wasn't fighting alone. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Drawings. Dr. Nina Alvarez was a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. She had kind eyes, a soft voice, and an office filled with crayons, stuffed animals, and paper of every color. Emily began therapy sessions with her 3 times a week. Children often can't express their experiences through words, Dr. Alvarez explained to Margaret during their first meeting. Trauma locks itself inside them in ways they don't understand, but art, drawing, painting, creating, can unlock doors that conversation cannot. At first, Emily's drawings were simple. A house with a red roof, a yellow sun in the corner of the page, a dog she wished she had but never owned. Dr. Alvarez praised each one, never pushing, never asking too many questions. But slowly, the drawings began to change. The colors grew darker. The shapes became more disturbing. One day, Emily drew a Tall figure standing in a doorway, a shadow with no face looming over a small girl curled in the corner of a room. The next session, she drew a door with 3 locks on it, then a window with bars, even though the apartment had none. Dr. Alvarez shared the drawings with Margaret in private. She's communicating, the psychologist said quietly. These images tell a story that Emily isn't ready to speak out loud. The locked doors suggest she felt trapped. The shadow figure represents someone who made her feel unsafe, someone with power over her. Margaret stared at the drawings, her heart breaking with each image. What do we do? She asked. We wait. We let her process at her own pace. Pushing too hard could cause her to retreat further. Dr. Alvarez placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. Your job right now is simply to be present. Let her know she's safe. Let her know she's believed. The following week, something shifted. Emily arrived at her session quieter than usual. She sat at the art table for a long time, staring at the blank paper. Then, slowly, she picked up a blue crayon and began to draw. When she finished, she handed the paper to Dr. Alvarez without a word. The drawing showed 2 figures holding hands. One was small, a little girl with yellow hair. The other was taller, older, with gray hair and a kind face. Who are these people, Emily? Dr. Alvarez asked softly. Emily looked up, her eyes glistening with tears. That's me and Grandma, she whispered. So I don't get lost again. Dr. Alvarez called Margaret into the room. When she saw the drawing, she couldn't stop the tears from falling. Emily reached out and took her grandmother's hand, the same way she had drawn it on the paper. You came for me, Emily said quietly. Nobody ever came before. But you did. Margaret knelt beside her granddaughter and held her close. I will always come for you, she promised. Always, no matter what. That night, Margaret placed Emily's drawing on her refrigerator at home, right where she could see it every morning. 2 figures holding hands, a grandmother and a granddaughter. It wasn't a picture of the past, it was a picture of hope. Emily was beginning to heal. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, she was no longer walking it alone. Chapter 11. The Confrontation with the Past. 3 weeks after Emily was hospitalized, Margaret received permission to visit Diane at Greenview Psychiatric Hospital. The doctors said Diane was more stable now. The medication was helping quiet the voices. She had moments of clarity that lasted longer each day, but she was still fragile, a woman standing at the edge of a cliff trying not to fall. Margaret drove to the hospital with a heavy heart. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know what to say. All she knew was that she needed to see her daughter, to understand what had happened, and perhaps, if it was possible, to find some path toward forgiveness. For both of them. The room was small and white with a single window that let in pale afternoon light. Diane sat in a chair by the window, thinner than Margaret had ever seen her, wearing a hospital gown that hung loose on her frame. When Margaret entered, Diane turned slowly. For a moment, there was nothing in her eyes, just emptiness. Then recognition flickered, and with it came tears. Mom, Diane's voice cracked. You came. Margaret crossed the room and knelt beside her daughter, taking her hands. Of course I came. I'll always come. Diane began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Margaret held her, stroking her hair the way she had when Diane was a little girl waking from nightmares. I'm sorry, Diane whispered between sobs. I'm so sorry. I tried to be a good mother. I tried to take care of her. But everything got so dark, the voices kept telling me things, terrible things. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I know, sweetheart, I know. I should have called you. I should have asked for help. Diane pulled back, her face wet with tears. But I was so ashamed. I didn't want you to see what I had become. I thought if I just tried harder, I could fix it myself. Margaret's own tears fell freely now. I should have come anyway, she said. I should have broken down your door if I had to. I accepted your silence because it was easier than facing the truth. That's my failure, Diane, not yours. She reached into her bag and pulled out one of the letters, the unsent letters she had found in the box. I read them, Margaret said softly. All of them. Diane's face crumbled. I wanted to send them. Every day I wanted to. But the voices said you wouldn't believe me. They said you would take Emily away, and I would have nothing left. She gripped Margaret's hands. I loved her so much, Mom, I still do. But I couldn't protect her. I couldn't even protect myself. Margaret thought of Emily's drawings, the shadow in the doorway, the locked doors, the little girl curled in the corner. Diane, she said carefully, what happened with Harold? Diane flinched at the name. Her eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. He seemed so kind at first. He helped with groceries. He watched Emily when I couldn't get out of bed. I thought he was a blessing. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But then I started noticing things. The way he looked at her. How much time he wanted to spend alone with her. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. She looked at Margaret with devastation in her eyes. I failed her, Mom. I knew something was wrong and I was too broken to stop it. Margaret held her daughter tightly. We both failed her, but we can't change what happened. All we can do is fight for her now. Diane nodded weakly. Take care of her, Mom. Do for her what I couldn't do, please. I will, Margaret promised. I swear to you, I will. The past could not be undone. But in that small hospital room, two broken women began the long journey toward healing, for themselves and for the little girl who needed them both. Word spread through Ashford slowly at first, then like wildfire. People didn't know the details. The police and social services had kept Emily's case confidential. But they knew enough. A grandmother fighting for custody of her granddaughter, a child who had fallen through the cracks, a family shattered by circumstances that could have been prevented, and the community responded. It started with Pastor William at the Baptist church Margaret had attended for 40 years. He announced a special collection during Sunday service to help with legal fees. The basket came back overflowing. Then the women's group organized meals. Every evening, someone appeared at Margaret's door with a casserole, a pot of soup, or a freshly baked pie. They didn't ask questions. They simply offered food and hugs and promises to pray. The elementary school where Emily would eventually enroll created a special welcome program. Teachers volunteered to provide extra support. The school counselor cleared her schedule to be available whenever Emily needed her. Even strangers reached out. Cards arrived in the mail from people Margaret had never met, offering words of encouragement and small donations. One afternoon there was a knock at Margaret's door. She opened it to find Ruth, the neighbor from the apartment building who had confessed her guilt. Weeks earlier, Ruth held an envelope in her trembling hands. I've been saving this for 2 years, Ruth said quietly. For emergencies, for my grandchildren's college fund. She pressed the envelope into Margaret's hands. I want Emily to have it. Margaret tried to refuse. Ruth, I can't accept this. Please. Ruth's eyes glistened. It won't erase what I didn't do. Nothing can erase that. But maybe it can help build something better. Margaret looked at the envelope, then at Ruth's face, lined with age and regret and desperate hope. Thank you, she whispered. That evening, Detective Callahan called with news. We found him, he said. Harold Brennan was arrested this morning in Virginia. He's being extradited back to North Carolina. The case is moving forward. Margaret sank into her chair, overwhelmed with relief. It's really happening, she breathed. He's going to face justice. We still have a long road ahead, the detective cautioned. But yes, Mrs. Davis, it's happening. When she hung up the phone, Margaret looked around her small living room, at the cards on the mantel, the casserole dishes in the kitchen, Emily's drawing on the refrigerator. She was not alone. Emily was not alone. For the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself to hope. The shadows were beginning to lift, but the hardest battles and the greatest healing were still to come. The day Emily finally came home to Margaret's house should have been a celebration. In many ways, it was. Margaret had prepared the guest room with fresh flowers, new bed sheets, and a small collection of books she remembered Emily loving. But healing, Margaret quickly learned, was not a straight line. The first night, Emily woke up screaming. Margaret rushed to her room and found her granddaughter, tangled in the sheets, drenched in sweat, crying for someone to help her. "I'm here," Margaret whispered, holding her close. "You're safe now. I'm here." It took an hour for Emily to calm down. It would not be the last nightmare. There were other signs of invisible wounds. Emily refused to use the bathroom unless she had checked the lock 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times. Only then would she enter. She hoarded food under her pillow, hiding crackers and cookies as if afraid there would be nothing to eat tomorrow. When unexpected noises startled her, she would freeze, her eyes wide with fear. One evening, a thunderstorm rolled through Ashford. The lights flickered. Emily disappeared. Margaret found her curled in the hallway closet, knees pulled to her chest, rocking back and forth. "He won't find me here," Emily whispered. "He won't find me." Margaret's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She crawled into the closet beside her granddaughter and held her until the storm passed. Dr. Alvarez had warned her this would happen. "Trauma doesn't disappear when the danger is gone," the psychologist explained. "It lives in the body, in the memories, in the reflexes. Emily will need years of support to fully heal." Margaret accepted this truth. She learned to be patient. She learned that some days would be good, and some days would feel like starting over. But there were also moments of light. One night, Emily couldn't sleep. Margaret sat beside her bed and began to hum an old lullaby, the same one she had sung to Diane decades ago. Emily listened, her eyes slowly closing. "Grandma?" she murmured. "Yes, sweetheart." "Can you sing it again?" Margaret sang. And for the first time since coming home, Emily smiled as she drifted off to sleep. The wounds were deep. The healing would take time. But love, Margaret discovered, was the strongest medicine of all. The day of Harold Brennan's trial arrived on a cold November morning. Margaret sat in the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The room was filled with lawyers, journalists, and observers. Strangers who had come to witness justice being served. Emily did not have to testify. The prosecution had built a strong case without putting her on the stand. The evidence spoke for itself, the hidden gifts, the handwritten notes, the testimony of neighbors and experts, and the drawings that told a story words could not. Dr. Alvarez testified about the psychological trauma Emily had suffered. Detective Callahan presented the evidence collected from the apartment. Even Ruth appeared as a witness, her voice trembling as she admitted what she had seen and failed to report. Harold Brennan sat at the defense table, his face blank, showing no emotion. He had maintained his innocence throughout the investigation, claiming he was simply a kind neighbor helping a struggling family. But the jury saw through his lies. After 3 days of testimony, they delivered their verdict. Guilty. Margaret closed her eyes as the word echoed through the courtroom. It was not enough. No verdict could undo what had been done to Emily. But it was something. It was accountability. It was the world finally saying that what happened to that little girl mattered. Harold Brennan was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He would die behind bars. As the guards led him away, Margaret felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Ruth standing beside her, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," Ruth whispered. Margaret shook her head slowly. "For him, maybe. But for Emily, the healing is just beginning." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, cameras flashing. Margaret declined every interview request. She had no interest in sharing her family's pain with the world. She just wanted to go home. When she arrived, Emily was waiting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. The little girl stood when she saw her grandmother's car pull into the driveway. Margaret walked up the steps. Emily looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "Is it over, Grandma?" Margaret knelt down and took her granddaughter's hands. "The bad man is going away for a very long time," she said, softly. "He can never hurt you again." Emily's lip trembled. Then she threw her arms around Margaret's neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Justice had been served, but the true victory was not in the courtroom. It was in the arms of a grandmother who refused to let her granddaughter be forgotten. Spring arrived in Ashford with cherry blossoms and warm breezes that carried the scent of new beginnings. 6 months had passed since the trial. 6 months of therapy sessions, quiet dinners, bedtime stories, and slow, steady healing. Emily still had nightmares. Sometimes, but they came less often now. She still checked the locks 3 times before entering the bathroom, but the fear in her eyes was fading, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Today was a special day. Emily stood in front of the mirror in her new bedroom, adjusting the straps of her pink backpack. She wore a yellow dress that Margaret had bought for the occasion, and her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids. It was her first day at a new school. "Are you ready, sweetheart?" Margaret asked from the doorway. Emily turned, her expression a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "What if the other kids don't like me?" Margaret walked over and knelt beside her granddaughter. "Then they're missing out on knowing the bravest, kindest girl I've ever met." Emily smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. Those smiles had been rare once. Now they came more often. "Wait," Margaret said. "I have something for you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate silver necklace with a single charm, the letter M. "This belonged to my mother," Margaret explained. "She gave it to me when I was about your age. I was scared of starting at a new school, too. She told me that whenever I felt alone, I should hold this necklace and remember that I carried her love with me everywhere I went." She fastened the necklace around Emily's neck. "Now you carry my love with you, too. No matter where you are, no matter what happens, you are never alone." Emily touched the silver charm gently, her eyes glistening. "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." They drove to the school in comfortable silence. The building was bright and welcoming, with colorful murals painted on the walls and children laughing in the playground. Margaret parked the car and walked Emily to the front gate. Teachers smiled and waved. Other parents said hello. It was a community ready to embrace a little girl who had been through far too much. At the gate, Emily stopped. She looked up at her grandmother, then at the school, then back again. "Grandma, will you be here when I come out?" Margaret smiled. "Always. I will always be here." Emily nodded. She took a deep breath, squared her small shoulders, and took a step toward the gate. Then she paused, turned around, and ran back to Margaret, throwing her arms around her in a fierce hug. "Thank you for finding me," Emily whispered. Margaret held her tightly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Thank you for letting me." Emily pulled back, gave one last smile, and walked through the gate. Margaret watched her go, watched her granddaughter join a group of children, watched her laugh at something one of them said, watched her disappear into the building. She stood there for a long time after Emily was gone, the spring sun warm on her face. The road behind them had been dark and painful. The road ahead would have its own challenges. Emily would need years of healing. There would be setbacks, difficult days, moments when the past reached out with cold fingers. But the cycle of silence had been broken. A little girl who once had no one now had a grandmother who would fight for her until her last breath. And Margaret, who once thought her life's purpose was behind her, had found a reason to keep going. The love of a grandmother cannot heal everything, but it can be the first step towards saving a life. And sometimes that first step makes all the difference.